Welcome back to this week's edition of Voluntaryist Academy. I almost said Hitchhiker's Guide to Truth there. I don't know why. Anyways, welcome back to Voluntaryist Academy. I'm James Cordiner. Voluntarystacademy.com is the website. Go there, check it out, get all the resources, get all of the works that I go through on this channel in PDF form. You can get them there. Tonight we'll be doing a little bit more into Men Against the State by James J. Martin, and we're going to be wrapping up, technically part one of the book. We're going to be wrapping that up tonight, and we're going to be diving into the fragmentation and decline of anarchist experimentation, and that should be pretty interesting. So I want to turn everybody's attention to the show notes, where you can get your own copy of this PDF just one click away. And while you're in the show notes, check out all the other links to the website, to AUTONOMY. Get into AUTONOMY, take that course. It's a 12-week course hosted by Richard Grove. Really break out of your shell, and it's a course of action, and you can learn more about it at getautonomy.info, and that link is in the show notes. You can become a member of the book club. I'm thinking about calling it the book club for Voluntaryist Academy, and where we can meet either once every 2 weeks or once a week to discuss the works on this channel that I go through every week. I'd like to thank everybody who tunes in to this. It means a lot. Leave a comment, do all that stuff on this episode, and leave a like, share it around, do all that great stuff. That's the easiest, and the easiest way to show support for this channel is to do that. I really appreciate all of that. So without any further ado, we'll just get right down to tonight's presentation. So this is chapter 4 of Men Against the State, titled The Fragmentation and Decline of Anarchist Experimentation. Interest in the economic and social experimentation taking place at modern times was not confined to the New York Furyites and the various unfriendly critics and denunciators frightened by the implications of the attack on the fundamental precepts of authority in the contemporary business system. The circulation of Warren's periodical letter and the publication of numerous letters in the London Leader dealing with sympathetic aspects of the equitable town on Long Island resulted in the development of a circle of proponents of the labor exchange principles in England. It is significant that the leading members of this group were long associated with Robert Owen and William Thompson, although by the early 1850s they had transmuted the new interest of Josiah Warren into an attempted breach in Owenism. The readers of Owenite papers in England had become acquainted with the ideas of Warren over a period of 2 decades or more by this time. From the point of view of practical operations, a much larger and more sympathetic audience existed in England, where labor exchange ideas were demonstrated on a larger scale than they ever were to be in America. About 6 months after the opening of the first Cincinnati Time Store in May of 1827, the first English trial along similar lines began in Brighton. The Cooperative Benevolent Fund Association, as it was known, established a central quote-unquote repository where members brought various articles of their own production. A designated committee issued orders payable in other commodities deposited by other members on a basis of equal value established on a scale which was constructed as close to original cost as could be determined. In the case where a person wished no products in supply, a labor note was issued to him which could be redeemed at a later occasion, quote, which note may be cancelled when articles of that value are issued for it, so that the labor notes may always represent the quantity of goods in store and work unrequited, end quote. And that was from Podmore, Robert Owen, page 386, quoted from Cooperative Magazine, November of 1827. I'm not going to read all the footnotes here, but sometimes it's good to read the footnotes. If you want to go through the footnotes, get a copy of this PDF for yourself. There is so much in these footnotes that in the future, a lot of this will be covered, but not necessarily based off the footnotes, but a lot of this will be gone through. In fact, as we go through this book, some of it already has been gone through on this channel, which is exciting. To continue with the reading, though, the labor exchange brand of cooperation gained considerable headway during the next 6 years in London and Birmingham, under the sponsorship of Owen and a gifted lieutenant, William Pear. This culminated in the establishment of the memorable national labor exchanges in those cities in May and July of 1833. Eminently successful despite their brief existence, the underlying idea inexplicably went into eclipse, intellectually as well as practically. The political heat produced by the Chartist movement, which sought to be distinguished from this particular variety of quote-unquote socialism, undoubtedly helped it into obscurity. See how it notes that there's a particular variety of socialism? That's important to keep in mind, because nowadays we tend to only ascribe one variety of socialism. We've gone over this already in parts 2 and 3, I believe. Maybe even in part 1, which was recorded quite a while ago. Check it out. Okay, so fired by the establishment of modern times and influenced by Stephen Pearl Andrews' Sovereignty of the Individual, English interest in the American anarchist decentralism revived, tempered by considerations peculiar to conditions in England. In 1853, a loose organization of these early scientific anarchists arose. Under the name of the London Confederation of Rational Reformers, the philosophy of the group combined the ideas of Warren with others of their own, hoping to realize in a countrywide manner the decentralist society which the Americans were attempting in independent small communities. William Pear continued to be a prominent associate of the London group, although his interests became distracted by agrarian cooperative enterprises in Ireland, dividing his time between stays in London and Dublin. The secretary and strong spirit of this new center of radicalism, for over 30 years occupied in some phase or other of the left-wing reform movement in England, was Ambrose Caston Cudden. Cudden was actively corresponding with Warren early in the year the London Confederation began its extensive propaganda campaign, which involved not only the use of Warren's stereotyping inventions as a means of disseminating their publications, but a reprinting of an English edition of the Equitable Commerce as well. The English supporters of Warren displayed little timidity in their efforts to spread their beliefs. Cudden brought the matter to the attention of important political personages, including the Prime Minister, Lord Aberdeen. While seeking support, Pear carried the story of the Warrenite villages and their basic operating principles before the reserved meetings of the Royal Statistical Society about 2 years later, in the summer of 1856. Explaining to his listeners Warren's use of the term commerce in the Old English connotation of the whole of the proceedings of human relations, Pear described its potentialities in enthusiastic and engaging language. Pear says, he describes it as this: it will be perceived by the acute intellect that a principle is here broached, which is absolutely revolutionary to all existing commerce. Perhaps a few minds may follow it out at once to its consequences far enough to perceive that it promises the most magnificent results in the equal distribution of wealth proportional to industry, the abolition of pauperism, general security of condition instead of continual bankruptcy or poverty, universal cooperation, the general prevalence of commercial honor and honesty, and in 10,000 harmonizing and beneficent effects morally and religiously. So 10,000 harmonizing and beneficent effects morally and religiously. So, English interest in the American trial villages remained on an intellectual level, despite a visit to both Modern Times and Utopia by Cudden in June and July of 1857. Although favorably impressed, his return to England resulted in no practical operations of any kind. Cudden continued to head up the literary front in the London area, publishing articles with a strong anarchist flavor in the Cosmopolitan Review and the Working Man throughout most of 1861 through 1862. The escape of Michael Bakunin from Siberia and his subsequent arrival in London on January 10th of 1862 provided another opportunity for Cudden to associate with the radical movement, heading the delegation chosen to greet the prominent leader of the growing proletarian wing of the anarchists on the continent. Henceforth, no uniformity prevailed among the members of this group. Cudden took a prominent part in the London Convention of August of this same year, at which the idea of the International Working Men's Association was broached publicly for the first time. He continued his relations with Warren and the Americans to the end, however, attempting to introduce the former's ideas on land among the adherents of cooperation in England without effect. Pear gradually drifted away from espousal of Warrenite principles into the camp of the Rochdale wing of cooperation, or Roche, or Roch. What do you guys think? I think it's Roch. Rochdale wing of cooperation, where he remained until his death in 1873. But Cudden's attachment remained strong. Now an old man and in straitened circumstances, his influence as a pamphleteer became negligible. Interest in American anarchist teachings in England was to remain dormant for over a decade after this, a revival taking place with the beginning of the journal called The Anarchist in March of 1885 by Henry Seymour. Most of Seymour's group soon broke away and gathered around Peter Kropotkin, who began publication of the communist anarchist Freedom in October of the next year. And for a summary of this matter, see article, quote, called The Oldest Paper on the Left in the publication called Freedom, Volume 9, published in April 3rd, 1948. The first paper of this name suspended publication in 1927, but in November of 1936, publication resumed under the title Spain and the World. Okay, changed successively to Revolt, with an exclamation mark, and War Commentary. Okay, then it reverting to the old name at the end of 1945. So thereafter, the followers of the Warrenite anarchism in England were to be a minority fringe among the advocates of the autonomous collective commune. The repeated appearances of Warren in the Boston area as a speaker between 1848 and 1852 met favorable response in more respects than the intellectual. Members of both the Ohio and Long Island towns were recruited there from time to time, the best known being the Boston group. It was also in the Boston area that the only prominent attempt at practical exposition of the equitable principles not begun by Warren took place. Its promise drew Warren himself away from Long Island for a time, during which he published a small sheet called The People's Paper, devoted to a description of the proceedings in the latter part of 1855 through 1856, before leaving to visit the Equitists in Ohio. Under the direction of men named Keith and Robinson, an attempt at forming a colony in the outskirts of Boston was made, but did not get beyond the stage of selling of land lots at cost price. Keith set up a cost price house of equity, quote unquote, house of equity in the city, which served to illustrate one element of the cost economy, although there was no use made of the labor notes. Other stores similar to this were set up in other parts of the state, among them South Boston and Lawrence, and the Boston suburbs of Charleston and Roxbury. In many ways, the conduct of the enterprises directed by Keith approached philanthropy rather than the system of cost exchange which Warren advocated and demonstrated. That's so crazy. Lawrence, Mass. All right, anyway, a businessman with investments in the Boston area as well as South America. His experimental stores passed on the savings to customers with little or no attempt to encourage the labor exchange among the patrons, as had been the practice of Warren in Cincinnati and New Harmony, as well as the mutualist towns. The destruction of the first Boston store by fire, closely followed by investment losses in overseas undertakings, brought about his withdrawal from active participation, but the independent equitable stores survived for some time afterward. Warren was dismayed by the widespread use of the word equity, which grew out of the success of Keith and his associates in the fragmentary demonstration of his ideas. Speculators quickly grasped the popularity of the term, and a rash of equity eating houses, is what they called them, equity produce sellers, and equity stores followed, while Warren ruefully noted the quote-unquote original houses of equity were, as he described, as plenty as blackberries. For a time during the summer of 1856, a village was under consideration in Cliftondale, where from 300 to 400 lots were surveyed and sold within 3 months. Warren himself considered constructing a building there, apparently with a view to remaining there as at least long enough to aid in the formation of a community similar to that on Long Island. But the withdrawal of the Keith group put these plans to an early end. While the 1850s saw the propagation of native anarchist ideas by Warren and Andrews, this was also the period of the introduction into America of early European anti-statism by Wilhelm Wettling and Joseph de Jacques. Wettling, a German immigrant, rejected the principle of private property summarily, which placed him in the opposite camp from the Warrenite Americans. So we got this German guy coming in, and he's like, private property? Screw that. And us American anarchists at the time were saying, away with you. After the failure of his communist community in Wisconsin, in 1853, he withdrew from the radical cause. So this is Wettling, Wilhelm Wettling. Wettling? I don't know. De Jacques, arriving from France, made New York his center of operations and published the first journal of communist anarchism in America called Les Libertaires from 1858 to 1861. At first a follower of Proudhon, no kidding, de Jacques broke away, reproducing the philosophy of the stateless commune in Les Libertaires during the years of 1858 through 1859 under the title Le Humanisphère, which was later collected and published as a single works in Brussels in 1899. Important in the study of the beginnings of 19th century anarchist thought, Weitling and de Jacques had little influence in the United States. Let me say that again. They had little influence in the United States, and their impact upon the native group was undiscernible. Not until the time of the formation of the IWMA, which is the International Working Man Association. That's right, IWMA. So not until the time of the formation of the International Working Man's Association, following the collapse of the Paris Commune, where anarchist doctrines of alien origin to obtain a following among American radicals. The continuation and intensification of war conditions had another effect besides dispersing many of the original settlers from modern times. Warren's retreat was brought about as well. Retiring to Boston in despair in 1863, he spent most of the year writing his full-length work, which summarized the philosophy and practical accomplishments of his 39 years in the field of economic and social reform. Published under the title True Civilization in the same year, this volume was unique among his works in the scope of its attention to the contemporary problems created by the war. This is the Civil War. It also disclosed a regression to the support of methods of social control which he first became acquainted with while with the Owenites at New Harmony between the years 1825 and 1826. A prominent feature of the educational system which had been under consideration at New Harmony at that time was the presence of a semi-military force among the young of the group, drilled in military tactics and created for the purpose of supplying the community with protection from invasion by unfriendly outside elements. Owen had been enough of a realist to anticipate the possibility of aggression, which thus made preparation for protection a vital part of community action. Believing that war would eventually be cast aside as a policy when societary reformation had taken place, there still remained the necessity for providing for the dangerous period of transition immediately ahead. Although this plan had gone quickly into obscurity due to the brief duration of the Owenite settlements, the idea remained with Warren for almost 20 years before being once more proposed. Provoked now by the presence of so much militarism, and surrounded on all sides by a behavior pattern which reflected on the whole the violence of the conduct of war, Warren displayed his disillusionment by now admitting, in the case of society as a whole, the necessity for the presence of a military group on a temporary basis, which he thought could consist of either policemen or soldiers. The architect of scientific anarchism in America carefully distinguished between the terms of general use and the connotations they carried in the free type of society which he advocated and had been striving to introduce through the medium of the autonomous local community. Government, he said, strictly and scientifically speaking, is a coercive force. A man, while governed with his own consent, is not governed at all. And that quote is taken from True Civilization and Immediate Necessity, page 28, and Modern Government, page 28, Modern Government, in Modern Government, pages 11 through 12. In a similar manner, he differentiated between the act of being within and under discipline. The former, he declared, was the situation prevailing in the voluntary community, while the latter, considered conventionally desirable, he likened to being under instead of within water. So he likened it to being under instead of within water. Hold on. In a third instance, he separated the concepts of leadership and what he called the quote-unquote deciding power. Leadership, he declared, was a state of affairs which inhered in the free consent of a voluntary assembled group of persons. Agreement preceded leadership. A 6-year-old boy could give the final order to 9 adult men who were in agreement as to the necessity and desirability of picking up a log. On a more complex level, the principle remained the same. When the act of leading impined upon the act of deciding, which Warren considered an individual matter exclusively, the invasion created an artificial situation, and as a result, coercion became an inevitable course of action. If men were to have, quote-unquote, government, an agreement as to principles had to be made. Opportunism, as the basis of society, was an admission that barbarism was the inevitable and normal condition of a man. If the search for principles was undertaken, Warren felt that statements of colonial times were adequate. He said, "I venture to assert that our present deplorable condition is in consequence of the people in general never having perceived or else lost sight of the legitimate object of all governments as displayed or implied in the American, quote, Declaration of Independence," end quote, end quote. This document, he contended, contained the entire essence of the democratic idea and constituted the base of all American institutions, however caricatured and distorted they had become as a result of ignoring it. The admission of the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was to Warren an admission of the indestructible principles of the individuality of persons and a restraint upon governments as the limits of their extension. As to the limits of their extension. Excuse me. What a beautiful thing to screw up. Anyways, rough around the edges. That's why you're here. Love you guys. To the ends of society, according to Warren, were 2. Permanent, universal peace and the security of both person and property. With reference to the latter, each individual exercised absolute authority here, and the mission of government was solely to ensure the continuation of peace and to repel invasions of individual rights. He said, "It is not the true function of governments to prescribe opinions, either moral, religious, or political, to meddle with manufacturers or importations, to prescribe the cut of the citizen's hair, to the employment of his time, or the disposal of his life or his property, but simply to protect him against such impertinences." He goes on to say, let's see, quote, "Coincidence must be had before anything requiring the cooperation of numbers can be properly done." So Warren admitted that, but positive governmental institutions erred in believing that cooperation could be approached in any other manner than by degrees. Governments merely produced chaos by treating diversity of views as dangerous to the public welfare, and punishing by imprisonment and death the expression of divergence in act and opinion from their desired uniformity of behavior. Constitutions were defective generalizations, he held, the rules of which were valid and effective only when applied to specific situations and specific places. Warren says, self-sovereignty in every individual is my constitution. Okay, that was Warren's reply to apprehension as to the effect of individual judgment of legislation upon law and order, end quote. Natural law, when violated, brought its own punishment. Natural law, when violated, brought its own punishment. The state of lawlessness prevailing in the social structures of man's construction was unknown in nature, and freedom was all that was needed for the individual to discover the fact for himself. All this Warren advanced in support of his plea for the free society, but he admitted that in the present conditions of the nation, the ideals of violence were too deeply rooted to make any consideration of natural living feasible. Perhaps something like that still exists today, but who are the ones that are perpetrating and who are the ones that are continuing this violence? Geez, the same people that make the laws. Who knew? It's almost as if they're making sure that their jobs exist and their slave mastery exists. Scum of the earth, politicians and lawmakers and order followers. To continue with the reading, a new approach and attended the changing of accepted attitudes, and Warren, believing that the war was about to plunge the North as well as the South into a state of deterioration and inversion little above the level of barbarism, proposed alternative agencies capable of being utilized as auxiliaries in the event of a stalemate or breakdown. One of these was a system of deliberative bodies which approximated the formal courts, the personnel to consist of quote-unquote counselors, who for the most part were expected to be the elders of the community. Serving without salary until their services had been supplied, and then only compensated by voluntary contributions, it was Warren's belief that such councils might settle the mass of community troubles without recourse to violence or punitive measures of any type. It was his conviction that such counselors in equity, as he called them, had social and educational as well as legal functions to serve, contributing to intelligent public opinion by airing the disputes of the citizenry in an intelligent manner before all who cared to be present. In the case of crimes involving violence or aggression, it was deemed more important to investigate the causes, thus arriving at appropriate and practical means of prevention, rather than relying upon the supposed inhibitory influence of punitive action, at best retaliatory and negative in effect. What a primitive idea. Oh my God. Yeah, but this guy was living in the 19th century. We could never do that today. People that say something like that when we present this philosophy and we present ideas like this to, average everyday people, and they go, well, that was back then, this is today. It's like, first and foremost, like that's like such a logical fallacy, which we should get back into covering. And I know this is like an aside, but this is such like beautiful philosophy that if we're just like, the whole mission of this entire channel is to explore these philosophies and to prove that the long existence of them, if we could just have polished them a little bit more and brought them more into the public zeitgeist and get in people's heads that like the possibilities are endless when we start off from when the starting line is is one of voluntary associations, consensual relationships between consenting people and adults, and and loving parents who look out for their children, and communities that exist based off of love and care instead of how a lot of them exist today. Like this, I'm trying not to let it get me down. But there are people out there that would argue against this, and their arguments are so dumb, but the tranquilized masses out there would just go along with their arguments because they don't want to be uncomfortable. They don't want to go through any changes. They don't want to metamorphosize into something more beautiful. They just want to be comfortable so they can make their money and have their house and do all this stuff, which is fine to a certain point. But when we're living in slavery, when it's taxation is not just theft, it's slavery. You can go and say no, but they can come and find you and put you in a cage. I mean, what else could that possibly be? You're not allowed to say no because we'll come and lock you up. We'll take all your stuff. That's our property now. You have to pay property tax. You can't ever really own your house. You're always just renting it from the government. Your mortgage pays the banks. The taxes pay the town. I don't want to be speaking into an echo chamber here. I hope that there's new people listening to this and I can get some clarity for them and help them really break out of their mindset of being a prisoner or being a slave and into like really being able to go out there and communicate these ideas for themselves in a whole better manner than maybe they were able to yesterday. But when it comes down to it, what we really need to be doing is we really just need to be telling the truth about these things. We need to be getting right down to the causal level of these things, just like what Warren is advocating for here. If we get down to the causal level, then we can work on preventative measures to make sure that this stuff doesn't perpetuate into the future and future generations don't have to be suffering through this. This is the whole point of voluntarism. This is the whole point of freedom and being an anarchist, is to make sure that the slave masters don't get to whip us anymore. I want to continue with this reading now that I've got that little rant out of the way. Thank you for everybody for being here. So let's go back a sentence. Okay, so in the case of crimes involving violence or aggression, this is a probably important one to repeat. In the case of crimes involving violence or aggression, it was deemed more important to investigate the causes, thus arriving at appropriate and practical terms or means of prevention. Okay, so we're taking things from a causal level, just like we should be doing in our own personal lives. What are the causes? So he wants to do that with violent crime, to discover means of prevention, rather than relying upon the supposed inhibitory influence of punitive action, at best retaliatory and negative in effect. So he's saying that instead of focusing, if we're just focusing on the effect and we're focusing on the punitive action, then you're not really solving the issues, which is intergenerational, maybe abandonment issues. There's a whole string of things. I don't want to get on another rant, but this is such the right thing. And it just bothers me that this is all written, this is all written over 100 years ago, over 120 years ago. It's like 150, 160 years ago. Such a novel idea to bring into the modern day. Oh, this guy's crazy. Anyways, granting that disorder and encroachment were bound to occur, which could not possibly be neutralized by the action in the non-invasive tribunals, Warren was hesitant and vague as to the extent to which force might be made recourse. At most, he sanctioned the formation of parallel bodies of militia. trained in preventative techniques and the use of restraint and the protection of person and property, in the event of collapse of the familiar civil order. Still convinced that social ills were a complex product and not the result of a streak of diabolism present within a portion of humanity, he was still hesitant as to how far society's agents might be permitted to go in penalizing actions which might be considered harmful. When compared with the brutal realities of the mid-Civil War period, Warren's suggestions for remedial action appeared simple and naive to hard-bitten thinking in terms of the techniques of power. Critics might hold that his free society postulated the existence of a rather high type of human material with which to work, and dismiss his constructive recommendations with no further hearing. Associates and sympathizers, on the other hand, looked with favor upon his condemnation of national and sectional patriotism. The recourse to war was an instrument of public policy, and the glorification of its destructive efficiency while engaged in the annihilation of the individual personality. In the summer of 1864, Warren moved to Cliftondale once more, resuming for a time his previous labors toward beginning another mutual town there, building upon the remains of the Keith essay of almost 10 years before. At the same time, he renewed the campaign of propaganda in the interests of decentralization, proposing the erection of a number of parallel communities. The new cities were to be located as close to existing communities, quote, as the prices of land and the facilities of intercourse will permit, end quote, and were to involve a greater degree of planning of the physical appearance. In order to avoid the elements of discord created at modern times in its early days and to promote aesthetic considerations, he suggested the mapping out of the nucleus intensively, including the streets and sidewalks. The entire area to be figured as a single unit when being settled in the contract of purchase. It was also recommended that the location of the industries contemplated be determined and that a central area designated as a common recreation center, inspired by his observations of the Boston Public Garden, become a prominent feature of any plan. Oh yeah, the Boston Public Garden became Boston Commons, what we have today known as Boston Gardens. Boston Commons, sorry. Continuing to reflect the pessimism toward the future that had filled true civilization, and looking forward to disintegration on a large scale as a consequence of the war, Warren had firm convictions that the Jeffersonian concept of cities as the source of society was still correct, and that the adjustment of human affairs awaited the simplification of social organization. Anticipating an exodus from the country and continuing relations with the earlier residents of modern times, who had sought escape from the war by fleeing to the Caribbean Sea, the Caribbean area, he at the same time made preliminary preparations for the setting up of similar colonies in Jamaica and Central America. The attempts at practical resumption of the equity movement were destined to be rendered ineffective. The physical and spiritual exhaustion and the widespread apathy of the first few years after the war proved too disheartening a soil to furnish the Warrenite ideas with sustenance. No outside support for his plans materialized. The Caribbean project languished, while Warren himself and a few friends continued a fragmentary association in Cliftondale and Boston, with a shrinking total of results to show for their efforts. For a time, the publication of the quarterly letter kept alive the intellectual aspect of the decentralist movement with practically no other support than that of a handful of old friends. But by 1869, the impulse toward investigation of the possibilities of the labor exchange in a non-coercive and autonomous individualist community situation vanished. While Warren had been circularizing friends and potential participants in a renewal of practical demonstration of equitable commerce, during the last year of the war, a Massachusetts protagonist had written, and who is this? 65. Guy Eugene Hutchinson to Josiah Warren. He wrote this on July 10th of 1864. Okay. And he writes, "Your plan of beginning a movement I do not feel competent to express an opinion upon. It seems to me that the public mind must in some way, by books, papers, or lectures, be indoctrinated with the true principles more before much can be done. I am ready and very desirous to do all I can for the great cause." Sounds like Eugene Hutchinson kind of understood a little bit. He had his finger on the pulse. He really got his ear to the ground. By the latter part of the 1860s, such an intellectual campaign had begun. Consisting for the most part of younger men and disillusioned veterans of a variety of reform movements, a loose group of radicals had begun a study of the literature and philosophy of opposition to the state and its centralizing effects upon the economic activities of the nation, which the struggle for control of political power and support by industrial, financial, and laboring interests presaged. Destined to be looked upon as intractable extremists for their insistence in basing their arguments upon principles and premises which excluded participation in political organization, they undertook an intensive examination of the writings of not only Josiah Warren, but other dissident individualists of prominence such as William B. Greene, Lysander Spooner, Joshua K. Ingalls, and their associates. Not satisfied with this alone, the men themselves were sought out and brought together into two loose federations which became known as the New England Labor Reform League and the American Labor Reform League. It was to these so William B. Greene and Lysander Spooner, they're both from Massachusetts. Joshua K. Ingalls, I wonder where he was from. Not satisfied with this alone, New England Labor Reform League and the American Labor Reform League. It was to these associations that the initiative and the dissemination of native anarchist thought passed. The active influence of Warren, now a man of over 70 years of age, having become stilled, still his association with the Reform Leagues was eagerly solicited. It was as the intellectual patriarch of these groups that he spent the rest of his life, where his infrequent words were given attention and his name always mentioned with respect. It was probably at the inducement of Ezra Heywood, around whom the Reform Leagues centered for a time, that he revised, edited, and enlarged his first work, Equitable Commerce, and published it for the fourth time while still at Cliftondale in 1869, under the title of True Civilization, a subject of vital and serious interest to all people, but mostly immediately to men and women of labor and sorrow. What a mouthful that was. This edition bore the designation Part 1 on the cover page, being essentially the first of Warren's larger writings on the subject of his thought and action. For the most part, the revision contributed nothing new to the body of native anarchist thought, although there were several clarifications of previous positions and indications of considerable reading in both history and jurisprudence. Having already made the mistake of combining their interests too closely, it appeared to Warren that being governed by the dictates of the greatest number was probably the best of a number of expedients, but gravely dangerous to the security of both person and property. He believed that political theorists explaining majority rule were eminently unsound in supposing that a concurrence of the vote indicated any such phenomenon as a quote-unquote greater will. The many hidden diversities of the individual personality, when multiplied by the number of persons taking part in any given election, created a huge barrier against any such expectation of coincidence. Unless political systems provide unlimited opportunity for the freedom to differ, the attainment of social harmony was impossible, and an invitation to the use of force in an attempt to obtain accord. Hence the erection of a quote-unquote soulless phantom called the state, in whose name men acted without having any conception of what it was, at the same time escaping the responsibility for acts which they would never have done as private individuals. When the leaders of the French Revolution spoke of crimes against the state, Warren declared that such phrases were nothing more than the conjurings of a barbarian imagination, which were later... Sorry, that's hilarious. Which were later used to absolve murderers of the responsibility for their crimes. Advocates of community of property were no better than the exponents of other types of organized society. He held, sinking the individual beneath his institutions was a course of action which was bound to frustrate the achievement of harmony. The production of true civilization was the last of Josiah Warren's activities in Cliftondale. His removal to Boston shortly after, for the most part, brought the period of experimentation in the practical aspects of American individualist anarchism to a close. His voice was henceforth to be a minor one during the early years of an unusually vigorous interest in the political and economic implications of anarchist philosophy, a period characterized by a great volume of published works and intellectual absorption in abstract considerations. The growth of Warren's stature as an exponent of Native American radical thought has been partially alluded to, but his followers for over 50 years after his death paid profuse tribute to the character of his life and the value of his contribution to the thought and the literature of freedom. Josiah Warren died on April 14th of 1874 at the home of Edward Linton, a ship carpenter, anarchist convert, and former associate of Warren's at Modern Times, in the Bunker Hill district of Charleston, Massachusetts. A substantial... Oh yeah, that's where it was. Sorry, I missed a comma there. That's where Warren died, in Bunker Hill in Charleston. Wow. A substantial half-column obituary in the Boston Globe the following day reported that he had been ill for some time but did not mention the cause of death. A mysterious aspect of the account was the total absence of any mention of Warren's forebears and surviving members of his family, customary materials to be found in obituaries. The largest part of the story was devoted to his already legendary experiences from New Harmony through modern times, and a serious and respectful summary of his philosophy, and concluded with a gentle tribute. Quote, "He was of kindly disposition, and leaves a large circle of friends to lament his death." End quote. That was from the Boston Globe of April 15th, 1874. Warren had been preceded in death by his wife, Caroline Cutter Warren, in Evansville, Indiana, in 1872, and by his elder brother, George, in Cincinnati in the same year. And for other matters, see Appendix 2. So I pull that up on my physical copy here. Maybe if I had thought ahead a little bit. Anyways, So that does it for, there he is, the man himself, Josiah Warren. That's Ezra Heywood. Of course, Lysander Spooner. We know that guy. Benjamin R. Tucker. And then next week we'll continue on with this reading with Chapter 5, Heralds of the Transition to Philosophical Egoism, Part 1. Okay, and that'll take up our time for the that'll take up our time for the month of August. This next part, okay? A lot to think about with this this last chapter that we read through tonight. A lot to think about. I really do suggest that people click in the show notes and get the link to get your own copy of this PDF and reread that for yourself or listen to this again or whatever. Go back there because there's a lot there that still, of course, applies to today. That's so. Look at that. So yeah, I mean, really, maybe even consider getting yourself a physical copy of this book for your own like home library. You know, it's really not that big of a book. You know what I mean? Like, it's hardly thicker than my finger. Well, I guess maybe I might have, I don't know, maybe I have a thick thumb, but really consider getting a copy of this book for yourself, because this is one of those ones that you hardly ever hear of. I mean, how many people have heard of this particular book? There's probably 100 other ones like it, but this one's pretty special. I like this book so far. Let me know what you guys think in the comments about this series so far. I appreciate everybody showing up and enjoying this rough around the edges type style that I present with. I do pre-read a lot of this, but when I'm reading it out loud for the first time for you guys, sometimes, my eyes work a little bit faster than my mouth, or maybe the other way around. This is a work of love, but if you guys would like to come and hang out and start a community, I'm offering that. And the proceeds go to keeping this operation going and growing. I have an interview that I'm editing at the moment with a musical artist that goes by the name of ANCAP Tim, and that'll be coming out probably in the next couple days. If there's anybody out there that would like to volunteer their time to spreading this channel onto other platforms, that would be great. You can contact me on the website, voluntaristacademy.com/contact. I believe it's /contact. Or you just go to the website, go to the contact page, and send me I don't know, send me a little letter expressing that you'd like to volunteer your time to help post some videos and get this channel caught up on a couple of different platforms. And so, yeah, I really am. I'm getting a lot of reading this again. I'm getting a lot out of reading this again. I really hope that you guys that are listening to this are getting an equal amount out of this. It's really important. Like I say all the time, it's really important that we take a look at history, because there's so much that can be learned from like a history provided by books like this. I say all the time that this philosophy is nothing new. And I'm not the first one to maybe put that little bug in your ear out there. But there's nothing new about this. We saw it tonight that there's enlightened thinkers and speakers out there today, saying a lot in their own words what Warren was saying over 140 years ago. What is it? It's 2025. He's saying the things that we went over. He's saying those things in 1865. Okay, let's call it 1865. Let's do the math there. It's 160 years, right? 160 years at least. And that's just going back to what we have on record for American anarchists. Okay? There is something happening here where we have this energy of freedom that courses through our veins as human beings. This philosophy has been passed down through the ages from ancient times. Okay? And this is a very modern interpretation of that energy. The energy, the desire for freedom. It's nothing new. If we take these old ideas, we apply them to today, they need some polishing. I say it all the time. They need some polishing for the modern day. If perhaps Warren and others of his time and ilk were listened to back then, and if perhaps some of the, notice how last week some of the ways that the communities were unsuccessful was because they were being smeared in the newspapers. I mean, it's literally like nothing new. It's nothing new. But we can form our own communities, right? Revolutions don't tend to just happen out of nowhere, and they're not successful if you're not building parallel systems outside of the current one, right? So we have to build alongside it, so that way there's a place to go where we exit to, and we can turn around and say, we're done, no thank you please. But the things that we're trying to exit from are that of violations on our natural law rights, coercive tactics meant to keep us enslaved. And so when we're talking about how do we exit from this, we have to talk about how do we exit from the mindset, how do we exit from the coercive tactics. We have to reject that. We have to full out reject coercion and violations of natural rights. We have to operate in voluntary, consensual relationships amongst each other and respect that almighty word, no. And with that, I will leave you guys. Thank you for tuning in. I really, really appreciate it. I love you all. And as I've been saying recently in the past, few episodes, just taxation is not just theft, is it? It's slavery. Taxation is slavery. And you own yourself. Like I always say, you own yourself, period.